And welcome back. We are now going to go ahead and get started on our steps to create our very first game in Unity. So in order to start, we're going to first load up Unity. And if you haven't started Unity before, the process to go about creating a game is pretty simple. You should simply load up the Unity Hub. You click on New Project. And once you do that, it's going to ask you to, of course, choose what kind of game you want to make. For our purposes today, we're going to choose to do a 2D core project, and we're going to name it. Now, if you can see in my example here, I've decided to call it Park and Dash. You can call it a different game if you want, but we're going to use that example that we talked about last time with the car simulator to kind of go ahead and build our first game. Now, once you've loaded up the 2D version of Unity here, you should see a window pretty much like this one. And when I loaded this up, I did have a small warning here, but then I went ahead and did a test run, which of course means there's nothing currently in the game. And I can press this and you'll see it will reload the domain, and then that little warning went away. And if we look at our game right now, this is exactly what you will see. There is currently nothing loaded here in Unity. We don't have anything in our inspector. Our game window is empty. We have a couple other things. So let me just go ahead and unpress play here. This is kind of our working space right here. This is our scene space, so everything as we start building our scenes will be here. This is our console. This is an area we're going to come to a lot, especially if we have any kind of errors. They will come up down here, or warnings. And then we have our project tab right here, which is a great way for us to kind of come in and see various different pieces here. Now you'll see over here we have a couple different things like favorites, assets, packages. I'm just going to go ahead and collapse that packages menu there because there's not going to be a lot I'm going to do with it to start. But I will work here in the assets folder quite a bit. And inside of assets, you'll see we do have a folder called scenes. And if I open that up, you'll see we have our sample scene, which matches what we have up here. So this is kind of our first scene here that we're going to be kind of starting at. Now, this may not be what we keep, but this is just to have a good starting point. Additionally, you'll see a bunch of other menus and stuff up here. Don't worry about everything too much right now because we are just getting started. All right, now the very first thing I'm going to want to do is I want to go ahead and start creating that car. And the way I can do this is I can actually come right here into my hierarchy here. I'm going to right click, and you can see we have a bunch of different options here. The first thing we see, create empty, we see 2D object, 3D object, effects. There's a whole bunch of things here, but we're going to start first with 2D object. And in here we have other menus. We have sprites, physics, tile maps, etc. We're going to first start with sprite. And there's, again, a bunch of different options here, but the one we're going to choose today to get started is known as a capsule. And when I click on that, you'll see that it adds this kind of ovular shape here into our game. This is a capsule object. And you notice that when it added it, it's asking us to give the option to rename it. And so this is a good chance for us to go ahead and rename these objects. Now, when we're naming objects, we want to make sure that they have names that have value. So, for example, I could call this player car. Since we know this is eventually going to be a car object, I can go ahead and call it. Now, if you want to call it something else like cruising speed or something like that, whatever you want to call your car, you can do that. I'm just going to call it player car right now because, again, that's what this is representing. Now, I can either click off this or press enter, and both ways will solidify my name choice, and now this name is in here. And just like that, we've started our game. However, if I hit play, nothing is going to happen right now because this capsule will exist here in my game, but you see it doesn't move, it doesn't wiggle. We don't have any of those core mechanics yet because we need to go in and add what is called a script. So before we start adding scripts, I want to take a moment to go back up to our assets level here. Now remember, we have a thing called scenes here, and I'm going to actually go ahead and be a little proactive here in my organization because we're going to end up adding multiple things to our game, whether it's sprites or images or whatever. I want to have folders for everything because then it'll be a lot easier for me to go find things. Our game right now will be pretty small, so it's not too hard to find things. But as our games start becoming more and more complex, it is going to be essential that we have these folders in place so that way we can access them when we need to. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click in here. And you can see we have a bunch of different things. I'm just going to go to create, and I'm going to do a folder. And it's going to ask me to name that folder, and I'm just going to call this scripts. And once that folder is named, you can see that it now exists here. Now, it does look different than scenes, and the reason for that is because right now there is nothing inside of scripts. Let's go ahead and change that. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click on that, or I can click down here in the menu. And either way, it will take me inside here, and you can see it says this folder is empty. So let's go ahead and add a script. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click, I'm going to go to create, and the second option here is called C# script. And that is going to give us the ability to start adding code. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that. And we want this code to ultimately be the code that allows us to drive. Now, so we could call this like player driver, car driver, whatever we want to call this. We can even just call it, driver. Whatever we want it to be, this is going to be the kind of script that's going to control our player. So I'm just going to press enter, and you can see this script is now created. And you can see that it adds this little bit of code over here in kind of like a preview window, so you can kind of see what the code is. And what we want to do is actually go back to player car. So I'm going to click there, and then I'm going to click on driver. I'm going to click and drag that over here to where it says add component. So I'm just going to click and release. And you'll see that it is now added that driver script. So that's one way you can do it. The other way, if you don't want to click and drag, you can always click add component, and you can go to your scripts, and you'll see drivers show up there. Both are ways for that to show up, but click and drag is kind of a nice way to do it, especially if you're not as familiar with some of the different menu navigations in Unity. Now, if we look at our program here, again, if we look at our code, you can see there's some code in here. We see, for example, it says void start, void update. These are examples of different things that exist within this driver class now. And even though now we've linked this driver to our capsule here, if I press play, it's still not going to do anything. We still don't have any movement or anything and that's simply because if we look at that script again, you can see there's nothing in here. So we actually need to go and create code, or we're going to create what's known as methods that are going to give us the ability to actually work within that game. So what is a method? Well, a method, the best way to think about it is whenever we want to execute a block of code, it is something that we need to use. It's known as a method, or sometimes you might hear it in programming circles as a function. These are commands that pretty much tell us, hey, game, we want you to do different tasks. We want you to drive that car. Now, when we look at methods, there's two primary types of methods that we're going to kind of start diving into here as we get further into game design. First of all, there are methods that already exist within Unity's libraries. So these are methods that we can easily call and invoke and do different things with. And then there are methods that we, the game developer, can go and create. So these are how we're going to actually go and add those different things such as movement and whatnot. Now, whichever method we use, there's always a rule that first that method has to be created, whether it's by us or by Unity, and then we have to invoke or call that method. And what does that mean? Well, creating a method just means we're going to give it a name and then give it a task of what to do. So we'll say, hey, if I want you to drive, I'm going to need you to, move the sprite forward. Invoking or calling the method simply says execute that task. It's like, hey, the code is created, because when I create a code to tell it to move, it's not going to actually move until it's time. So for example, a way to think about this is, for example, I go ahead and press a key that says move, but if I release that key, I want that sprite, for example, to be able to stop. I don't want it to just keep driving. So now that we know what a method is, let's go ahead and actually start adding and editing code. So I'm just going to go to my driver class here. I'm just going to double click that. And that's going to go ahead and open up inside of Visual Studio here. And once that's opened, you can see we have the exact same code that we saw in our preview here. So for example, we have our void start and our void update. Now, these two methods here, the void start and void update, have special roles for Unity. So start is any code that is in here will execute when we press that play button. The update method will execute code pretty much once every frame. So these have two different roles. So any script that has this start attached to it will always run at the beginning of the game. Whereas update will pretty much, you can think of it, it's a thing that's constantly coming back one frame every game. So you're constantly updating it. It's, something new, something refreshed. Now, before we go ahead and jump into working with any code here, let's take a moment to go back to Unity and take a look at what are the things that are going to actually affect rotation, because we want to pretty much be able to rotate it left and right. So, for example, turning. So to do that, I'm going to grab the player car here, and I'm just going to scooch him over a little bit, maybe zoom in a little bit here so I can see this a little better. And if I look at the transform window here, all right, position is, of course, just affecting where that is within our screen. The scale is the size of this, and rotation, of course, is where that's going to be. Now, the easiest way to do this is I can come here and play around with each of these values. But the thing you also have to remember is this x, y, and z. And it might be a little bit different than what you might be used to thinking about. But if I take this z number, for example, and I start changing this. So, for example, let's make this 15. You will see that it has rotated to the left. If I were to make this, let's say, negative 30, you'll see that it rotates to the right. So that's a pretty cool thing. And I can actually click and hover over that z value there to actually go ahead and get those into different values. And you can see it moves, maybe not as quickly as I want to, but it's a way for us to know that this is the coordinate that we're going to want to work with, is this z-axis. If I try to make it x and y, because you might think, oh, this is x, this is y. Well, if I change one of these values, let's say y to 50, you see only thing it did was kind of skinny this guy up, which is not what I want here. If I go to x, change that to 50, he got a little fat there. Not what we want. We want this z coordinate because we want to have this rotate left or right. Now, one other thing you might notice is that we have up here different pieces of our game. So we have different toggles and stuff like that, but we're not going to worry about all these quite yet. So here in our methods, we want to effectively control that player. Now, we're not going to dive fully into today the full movements that we need. We just want to first look at that transform property that we just saw a second ago. So when I look at this here and I look at my transform screen, we have, of course, our z rotation. Remember, when we put a number in there and we started manipulating that, we, of course, saw that this can rotate. So we want to use transform and rotation. Those are the two key things here we're going to use. So keep that in mind, transform and rotation. And when we go ahead and look at this in our Visual Studio, we, of course, have our start method. So let's just see how this looks here. So let's use transform. All right. And helps if I can spell transform. And we hit dot, you'll see that we get a bunch of different things. And the key thing is putting that period there, all right? So transform dot, and we get a bunch of different options in here. All right, and if you remember, what was the thing that we said that we wanted to use? Oh yes, we wanted to use this thing called rotation. So I can click on rotation, or there's also a rotate. The thing that we want is rotate, because of course you can see if I hit rotation, it's giving me this weird like identity thing because it's trying to suggest like, hey, here, use this. But that's not what we want. We want to be able to set a value. So I'm going to just use regular rotate, and I can either tab that over, double click, however you want to do this. I'm just going to press tab and tab again. And what this is going to do is just says, hey, when this game runs, rotate it to a position of 0, 0, 0. So that means 0 in the X, 0 in the Y, and 0 in the Z direction. So again, that is right here. It's coordinated to a rotation. 0 in the X, 0 in the Y, and 0 in the Z direction. Now, we won't really see any changes if I do this, so I just want to go ahead and change this over to a value that might be, let's say something like Z is 45. Something that we can witness it doing. So let's go here, change this last 0 to, let's say, 45. And we'll just hit save, because we want to make sure we save our changes. I'm just going to hit save all. And now that I've done that, if I go ahead and press play, you'll see that this has now automatically moved to 45 degrees. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and pull this out so I get kind of a split screen view here. And I can kind of see these. I'm going to adjust this just a little bit. And you can see here is my sprite. And if I hit it, play again, it'll stop the game and it returns to that same initial position. Now, that's cool, but we want this so that way it's updating. Because remember, we want to be able to have the player be able to have control. So I'm actually going to go back to my code, and I want to move this from start, so I'm just going to grab that, and I'm just going to drag that down to update. All right, and now if we go ahead and save that again, and go back to Unity, and now I press play, you'll see it's going kind of crazy, and it's because if you look at this, it's changing that by like 45 every frame. So that's a little crazy. Maybe we don't want it that crazy. If I hit pause, you can see it will stop. And it stopped right there. If I do it again, you'll stop at a different 45-degree position. So that is pretty cool that it is actually updating that to different spots. But again, a little too crazy for what we want. So let's go ahead and head back to Visual Studio one more time. And I'm going to drop this down to, let's say, a decimal. Let's say 0.1. Now, if you notice, it does give us a little red squiggle. All right. And that's because it says, I can't convert this from a double to a float. Oh, it's a float. Now, floats are special type of numbers. We haven't talked about those yet. So all we need to know for today is just add an F to the end of that, and they'll automatically take care of that. And we don't have any red squiggles anymore. So we'll go ahead and save this. And let's go back over to Unity. And now I want to go ahead and press play. You can see it is now turning at a nice steady degrees here. So this is a good start for our game. Obviously, it is not everything, but we now have our first method kind of being used here. We called it was the transform.rotation. So using that knowledge, we'll be able to build on it for future things going forward.